Hi everyone. Thanks for joining us on this panel on empowering users, can safety by design learn from tech for good? I thought I'd start off by just touching on safety by design and the kind of current status of it. So, safety by design and the discussion around it has been a big focus in the online harms white paper, which hopefully we'll hear some more about today, but it was also pulled out in the Queen's speech this year, so it's definitely something that the government is focusing on, and I think companies themselves are looking at more closely. We are joined today by Noor Moala, who is the commercial director at .Everyone, a think tank focused on responsible design, and before that I think worked in the tech for good space. Antonia Bailey, DCMS lead on safety by design. And before that worked in the startup and scale-up sector. We have David Hunter, head of special projects at CRISP, which tackles bad content online, and Dr. Rachel O'Connell of Trust Elevate, which looks at age verification solutions online as well, and I think has a long and distinguished career in tech companies from Bebo and tackling bad content online as well. So, great panel. I think in the public lexicon, issues like safety by design or tech for good kind of 5 years ago wouldn't have necessarily been much of a focus or rung true with anyone. Kind of the expectations of companies are changing, especially over recent years. So I thought good to kick off with kind of what safety by design means to each of you. So Noor, do you want to start?
Yes. So safety by design. Well, first of all, as .Everyone, we champion responsible technology. So safety by design is part and parcel of the work that we champion people to do. And to us, safety by design is a way of mitigating harms before they happen, and a way of thinking about consequences of the technology that you build before we get there. It's our view, though, that safety by design should go hand in hand with responsibility by design. So not only setting out to do no harm, but also to make sure that the intent from the very beginning is to build technology in a responsible way.
Absolutely, I think the position of GCMS is that safety by design is a really important preventative, proactive approach to tackling online harms. The approach set out in the white paper was away from a kind of reactive approach to forms of illegal or harmful content, and really focusing on that kind of preventative upstream approach or measures that can be put in place. So that's kind of the area that we think safety by design sits in.
For us at CRISP, so we are a commercial organisation. We work with a lot of platforms, kids and teens platforms, larger platforms, dealing with all of types of harmful content. A lot of the time, safety by design isn't factored in to platforms. A lot of the time we're covered or contacted based on a crisis, something that's gone wrong, because platforms that have existed for a long time didn't have safety by design in mind. They weren't created with any safety in mind. They were created with a goal of growth, users, numbers, and they're now coming into a world where they understand that they need safety. Newer platforms, new kids on the block, really need to think about safety by design, and some certainly are. Making sure that their technology, their services, their people all have safety in mind. And this isn't just a tech thing, this is designing their whole service and their whole solution, because I'm sure we'll talk about it, but technology won't solve this problem at all. And where people are thinking about safety by design, it isn't just a tech problem, it's everything that goes with it.
How many people here last night saw Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez? Yes. How amazing was that? That was like watching The Wizard of Oz when the curtains are pulled back and you see So basically she was quizzing Mark Zuckerberg, saying, okay, you're going to implement Libra, so let's just go back and have a look at your history in terms of the impact you've had on democracy. And it was, but honestly, I would suggest I know these kind of hearings, Senate hearings, are not things that people usually spend a lot of time, but this is worth watching. That, and also the Ottawa session, the sessions in Ottawa earlier this year, where lawmakers and ministers came together from a number of different countries. And you could see where people were realizing, the lawmakers, hang on pick a second here. The internet is a fantastic thing, but we've been taken down this specific path, and maybe we didn't think about this carefully enough. Maybe there are ethical and human rights issues that haven't been given the right consideration. And perhaps this whole notion of self-regulation and, the industry saying, listen, we're the experts, leave it to us and it'll all be fine, that maybe that hasn't worked out so well. So I think I would say about safety by design, it is a critical thing, but it needs to be legislated for. It needs to be mandated. At the heart of the GDPR, of the General Data Protection, is the concept of human rights, all of our rights to privacy. It's enshrined in law. And because it is, and there are massive penalties for mishandling the data protection, retention, and if you have a breach, etc., now companies are paying attention. If safety by design is a brilliant principle, but it needs to be backed by regulation, there needs to be serious consequences for not thinking about it. And lawmakers, and I think what we're seeing, we're at a significant inflection point where lawmakers around the world are realizing we have to actually get together and collaborate and work out these things. We know what the risks are. We had this discussion, we know what the risks are. So now we need to put in place mechanisms that will enable safety by design to be mapped out, ethics, human rights, algorithmic transparency, a full understanding of what those risks are to people's human rights and the economy, etc., and have those built into and recognized in law. And then I think we could make some progress in terms of reclaiming the internet to be the fabulous thing that it can be.
Great. I just wanted to pick up on that last point around kind of ethics and human rights. So I think to a lot of people, safety by design is viewed as content moderation. What tools can be adopted to improve content moderation and tackle content once it's already online. Yes. And just kind of looking, is there a wider interpretation of that? In that human rights aspect, or from a company aspect? Is it just after the fact, or does more need to be done in the run up?
Sorry, I can speak to this. Actually, bring up 2 points following up on what David said and definitely what Rachel said. There are two things. My voice is quite low, so can you hear me in the back now? Great. So following up on both Rachel and David's points, there are two things I think we're all furiously agreeing on as a panel. One is that tech issues are not separate from human issues. And if we all recognize that, then there also is a recognition that protecting fundamental rights alongside harm prevention is important when we're thinking about safety by design. And if we agree on these 2 points and go forward from that, then it becomes clear that actually just thinking about taking down content when it's dangerous, or retrospectively thinking about all the things that should have been done when this platform came out, is not enough, and regulating solely for that is not enough. And the issue is we need to, within regulation and doing these things, we need to innovate at the same pace as technology, and everyone in this room, I'm sure, knows that that is extremely difficult to do. So what else is there that we can do, right, to regulate responsibly? And that's why we, as .everyone, say that we advocate for thinking about building technology in a responsible way. And when we change that framework so that it does protect fundamental rights and not only thinks about harms, then that is a more comprehensive way of dealing with it. And if we're looking through that wider lens, then it makes it easier for us to all work together to do that.
And I think picking up on the point that you said, David, about technology isn't going to necessarily fix all this, that's exactly the point. While things like content moderation tools, filtering software are fantastic tools for particularly taking down the most abhorrent illegal images, by kind of over-focusing on content, you take away from the kind of role of the role of the creator actually in those services and products. There needs to be conscious and creative consideration of user safety. Further upstream, just plugging in technology won't solve the problem and often passes the buck onto that software as opposed to the creator.
And David, in your work with companies over the last few years, have you seen a shift from that to kind of, content moderation after the fact towards building it in as a basic?
Yeah, and one of the kind of key words or the concerning words in the question is around content, because in some areas, content is an absolute problem. So if we're talking about illegal child sexual abuse material, there is an absolute line where the content is a problem. But actually, in terms of a lot of the things that are causing problems in our nation and other nations, it really isn't content alone that's the problem. It's actually the behaviour that goes with it. So in the real complex areas of hate speech or hate crime, the content that comes out of one person's mouth in one context is the same as the content that comes out of another person's mouth in a different context. You can't filter and you can't deal with it at the content layer. You're dealing with it at the behaviour layer with context, and all of these things, from a technology alone perspective, become a real problem. From a human rights, from a privacy perspective, from a free speech perspective, again, just thinking about it at the content layer causes real problems. Actually, sometimes you never even get off the starting blocks just by thinking about the content. So, kind of as was mentioned, there is a person behind the keyboard or behind the screen that's creating the content, creating the output, and really it's about those behaviours, which is where the problem becomes even more complex, rather than the content itself. Some areas the content is the key, but most of the time it's not.
And I think the Online Harms White Paper does have a section that talks about digital media literacy and user empowerment, and recognises the fact that, frankly, these harms are occurring online because of people, and there is a role that needs to be played there in educating people. But I think also, the focus around technology always being about identifying content and taking it down kind of moves us away from some really interesting areas in kind of behavioural disruption. You can have live monitoring on a keypad that can let people know that actually you're about to violate our terms and conditions, or get close to violating that, or prompt people towards support or help, and kind of change people's behaviour online, as opposed to just constantly saying, that's wrong, take it down.
Great. Rachel, you mentioned the role of legislation, and just on that concept of roles and responsibilities of kind of each person, kind of where do you see the split? So we talked, I think, at the start of the day around citizens, governments and companies, and kind of where responsibility should lie. Where do you kind of see the split there? Is there also a responsibility for the education sector in giving these kind of skills to developers as well?
I think if we're thinking about safety by design, we've had that kind of siloed approach before. And that's what's typified and that relates to that whole thing of getting concerned about online grooming and separate moderation and all of these issues. And then what are the parts of each stakeholders? We need to adopt a more systems thinking approach. And I think that a person on the previous panel said this also, where the internet isn't the same now as it was in the beginning. It's an API-based economy that's multi-sided. So similarly, we bring in legislation in relation to payments, for example, and it is separate. The regulator for that is a Financial Conduct Authority. The regulator for handling data protection issues is the ICO. Now, on content platforms or gaming platforms, you're able to pay for things using a bank-to-bank transaction. So you've got a blurring of boundaries between the roles of regulators. So therefore, we need to kind of rethink, and that's really interesting about the online harms regulator, as maybe I see that as an oversight body that will look at coordinating the activities of different regulators. And if you have that kind of oversight mechanism in place that looks at accountability and transparency in relation to tackling these issues, then you can have the principles of legislation trickle down. That alters the dynamics of the constituent stakeholders then, as in citizens and other companies, because you have from the beginning, from the outset, a safety by design, privacy by design approach, and an ethical approach to creating the internet that we kind of want, which is a little bit different to what we have now. So I think that kind of, we've had 22 years, 25 years of experience of what the risks are and how effective or ineffective legislation is. It's bringing that collective wisdom together to now rethink what is the future of the internet, where is it going? And to give you a good example, look at WeChat in China. Every single WeChat, how many people here are familiar with WeChat and Alipay? You do everything on WeChat. You pay your taxes, you buy your travel tickets, you watch movies, everything. And if you look at the direction Facebook, Instagram and WhatsApp are taking us toward, it's towards that. So there needs to be, in the safety by design, a critical part is horizon scanning, looking to the future and then kind of working back from that, rather than being reactive and siloed and kind of going, oh, we need to tackle this one issue over here, and we'll have a whole load of stakeholders who are not talking to the stakeholders over here. And therefore the effect is minimized.
Great. So I guess kind of that siloed approach is one challenge that the sector faces. You know, what are the other challenges that you think are generally faced by the sector? You know, does the future changes in technology, will that impact? You know, I'm thinking around kind of decentralized technology.
So I think the interesting thing about emerging technologies and different technologies is that they're a challenge to everything to do with online harms. You know, it's a hugely dynamic place. I don't actually know whether that's necessarily a core challenge with safety by design at this stage, because, you know, ultimately we want to get to a point where people are thinking consciously and instinctively that they can be agile and reactive to emerging harms. I think a greater challenge at this stage is actually something that David said at the start, which is the culture just that isn't there at the moment. There has been an over-focus on commercial points, usability. You're seeing an interest in secure by design and privacy by design because legislation is there. But actually a real problem right now is getting people to think that safety by design is important and it isn't at odds with their commercial goals.
Yeah, and you know, thinking about the challenges wider around, you know, thinking outside the UK, emerging markets coming online, additional cultural, language, other problems that come with it, you know, cheap technology and data access that's going to bring all sorts of problems that people haven't even thought of. You know, we know that platforms are sitting in, you know, by far and wide kind of the West Coast US, thinking of a West Coast US view, solving problems in English that they're aware of within their own space, when in reality the people on their platforms are from all over. There's really no single global jurisdiction that they're operating under. There's no real standard for laws and the things that go with it. 19 countries at the moment have no laws on the grooming of children online. So, you know, what do you do about this? Where do platforms start when they're thinking about, well, where do our terms and conditions sit? Where do our requirements and, you know, what are we expected to do, basically? And can understand why it becomes a real problem.
That's a really good point. And I think one of the things that wasn't developed when the internet was created first was an identity layer, digital identity layer. So the challenge and the opportunity that exists, because if you can limit grooming and sexual abuse of children online if you keep the adults away from the children and create safer spaces for children. Like we have in schools, when the kids go into kindergarten, there's little tiny seats for them, it's all designed for them. You wouldn't put them into a secondary school, they're going to get hurt. So we need to, there's a huge amount of investment that has happened in governments around the world in terms of enabling digital identity and standards that have been developed that enable pseudonymous verification. So if it's an activist, their privacy can be maintained. So there are there's granular levels of trust that you need in somebody saying, I am this person, I am this specific age, I do have parental responsibility for the child, for this child. So there are different ways of tackling these problems in relation to risks that children experience online. And I think the investment in time and opportunity, the investment that the European Commission has made in developing these technical standards that interoperate with standards that have been developed in America and other parts of the world, creates an opportunity for a kind of safer internet and to minimize those things. Obviously, these systems will still be games, so you need intelligent monitoring systems, and there still needs to be education. But ways to mitigate the threats are emerging, and having those inculcated or included in the safety by design principles at the get-go means that you then remove the situation where it's like, yay, it's a young startup and woohoo, they'll get great, and it, you know, they don't have the money to think about protecting kids, so let's see what happens. That kind of approach will be altered such that safety by design is integral to their proposition to the market.
But in that, you know, in that mold, you know, you don't get to put a drug on the market and see what happens to it and eventually put your safety, you know, safety measures in place. Yes. Or create an electronic device and sell it to a few people and just check that it's sound. And in terms of the safety challenge with some of those kind of more traditional products, you can understand it's safe and release it because the product is the product and it's not going to evolve. These online spaces, the behaviours, the harms are going to change. People are going to change their tactics. The world's going to move on and things are going to evolve. And this is not going to be a one-shot, our platform is safe and it's now out there. You know the drug's safe and you can put it out and you have ways of monitoring that. But this is a constant daily battle. My team of 30-plus analysts are looking at these problems every day, and they do change every day, and new things come out every day. From a tech space, the world of antivirus is a similar model. You can solve some known problems, but new things are going to come out all the time. And taking some of those approaches, we'll get some way to solving the problem.
Yeah. Can I just speak to that point in terms of the model of privacy by design being part of the GDPR? So every company must conduct a data protection impact assessment, have clear policies and network security policies and policies for responding to data breaches, etc. There's a full, thorough data governance process that has to be put in place. Safety by design, if it followed the same model, you'd have to do a child safety, for example, if we're concerned about children, you'd have to do a child safety impact assessment. You'd have to document that you understand what the risks are and what measures you've taken to mitigate those risks. You don't necessarily have to mitigate all the risks from day one, but you have to have a roadmap there, and the regulator will then sign off on it. So it's that kind of rigor and governance that needs to be kind of put in place and can follow then the model that the GDPR has kind of been so innovative in putting in place.
Just wanted to bring in
Yes, if I could add to that, we've spoken a little bit about horizon scanning and how technology is changing all the time, and what we've been talking about as a panel so far is what to do when things go really badly. And I just wanted to bring us back to the point that actually the scope of duty of care when it comes to safety by design should include everyday things like consumer safety, like what's to consumer detriment, what are the economic harms of the technology that you're building. I mean, you're talking about AOC yesterday asking those questions yesterday, and we forget that Cambridge Analytica, it was the mundane things that we do with tech that sometimes harms us most, because that's the most overlooked. Yeah. So the unintended, it's really important to think about regulation, when we think about our responsibility as consumers, as well as businesses who build technology, to think about the unforeseen or the unintended consequences of the technology that we do. And again, from a regulation perspective, think about incentivizing being responsible in building technology, and not only thinking about what to do when the worst case scenario happens, because those are things we can't always think of or plan ahead for. But what we can do is start to build a community of responsible innovators who work within a framework that they understand that when bad things happen, when harms happen, then we know what to do with this now because we've planned for this ahead of time. Yeah. So that's what we'd like to see happening in the world as .everyone, what we're championing to do. And we're working with businesses. Actually, that's the line of work that I do. I work with businesses, charities, and other organizations to embed responsible practices from the beginning as people are building technology, and asking those questions like, what about your consumers? What are the data that they input? What does this mean does this mean that they're going to be, this is going to amplify things that are human? Like, will they be classed as other people who shouldn't be targeted by advertising, and therefore they cannot benefit to the extent that other people do? And that's not a very bad online harm, but it is something that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, definitely.
Antonia, we have the government response of the online harms white paper coming up.
Something to look forward to.
Not going to ask exactly what's in it, but are there any countries or specific practices that you're taking inspiration of, around the world?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I think the thing, though, with the white paper is that it really was putting forward quite a bold approach. So we've tried to look as far as possible where there is precedent. In some places there haven't been, especially in the space of online harms. But In the space of safety by design, I have been working quite closely with the Australian e-safety Commissioner's Office, who've been doing some quite interesting work, and touching on some of your points about actually going much further than quite a narrow scope of harms. They've recognised that kind of a full holistic approach is needed right upstream. They're working with Stanford University to embed safety by design approaches in engineering and design courses, which I think is so important, right the way through to that point about unintended consequences. And then, kind of actually just specifically targeting kind of high impact safety measures. I can't go into detail about what the government response says, but we are hoping that over the next 6 to 12 months, we can build out further the policy that was in the white paper and put forward some concrete proposals.
And for the rest of the panel, is there anything specific that you would like to see within that safety by design strand?
Can I just jump in very quickly and just remind that pretty much the entire legislative approach in the online harm white paper is about a safety by design approach at that kind of macro level of preventative, proactive action. The area that I lead on is more specifically around the type of support we can give companies to kind of consider those ethical consequences.
Well, definitely incentivizing responsible building of technology. So safety by design and responsibility by design would be great. And I think there's really a good opportunity here. We didn't really touch much on tech for good, and which is the background that I come from. And what's been really heartening in the UK is the number of people who are now working in tech for good, and tech workers who are now starting up on their own and building tech for good companies. And what it tells us is that there is definitely an appetite and a very good understanding of people wanting to do good things with technology. Mm-hmm. So if that appetite is there, there's definitely an appetite for an innovating responsibly regulatory environment to be put there, and I think the UK can definitely be leading on that in the world. So we're, instead of looking to internationally to see who's doing it best and trying to catch up with them, we are at the vanguard already with Tech for Good, and we should be as well in doing this.
That's cool. And I think that what you're identifying there is that kind of bottom-up approach, whereas in a post-GDPR world, our trust in these large companies has been massively eroded. And whereas it used to be an amazing thing to work at these large companies, I won't mention any names, developers are now saying, hey, actually, I want to leave and I want to set up a different company that actually has a positive social impact. Because there's a recognition amongst us all as humans that there should be a more socially equitable contract between companies, digital companies, and us. And so there's an appetite amongst developers and the tech industry, some parts of the tech industry, to innovate. And I think I said at the start, we are at an inflection point, and this post-GDPR world, there's kind of some hope in that, because there is a push towards that, and it's top down from regulation, but also bottom up, which is, I think, a very positive thing. And the final point then is to think about this at a national, but also an international and a supranational level. And what is the responsibilities of national governments, EU, and then also organisations like the Internet Governance Forum, W3C, and the World Health Organization, which is doing a huge amount of work about digital advertising and the connect of junk food and that connection to obesity, etc. So I think tapping into, rather than being isolationist, tapping into those areas of push towards tech for good and safety by design is a beneficial thing to do.
Just want to open up to the audience. I think we have some questions on Slido, but I guess if there's a roving mic, are there any questions from the audience?
Cheers. Just regarding safety by design, and I'm just thinking back to perhaps venture capitalists and those who invest in these technologies, how far can you bring that conversation up the chain? Because you're thinking of bottom line at the end of the day, like I said before, users, numbers, etc. How far do those who are investing in these technologies and these companies think about, you best put this in your plans?
Question? Yeah, VCs.
VCs. So actually, doesn't entirely answer your question, but I bring hope to the table because what I can say is by some of the organizations that we work with have come to us and said, we want to embed good governance practices at the board level. We want to start investing in startups and not only looking at their P&L and all of the other things that you have to audit if you invest in a company, but we want to see whether they have responsible practices in building tech as well embedded already. So there's already a movement to do that. There's a small group of people who are having conversations, who are actioning this, and I think very soon you'll start to see that. And the other thing is we forget that there's already an existing framework for responsibility. There's actually two. One, in business, there's B Corp. So B Corp now exists in the UK and more work is being done and more companies are starting to adopt that. And the other thing is I don't know if you've heard of the Sustainable Development Goals. So we have a framework for good that exists for the world and more businesses are now accelerating towards the SDGs and starting to report on their business within that framework. And some of that, and that's some of the work that we're doing at Dot Everyone, is tying responsibility in tech to the SDGs and showing how they're not separate, they are one and the same, and here's the framework with which you can move forward. So
yeah, as a we're a tech startup and we're fundraising at the minute. It's tough out there, to be honest. But I have seen a change in the last, say 3 years ago, if you're talking about GDPR, investors, particularly in the US, were like, it's never going to happen. And don't be crazy. That would have to change. GDPR would change the entire ad marketing ecosystem. You're on drugs if you think that's going to happen. But 3 years later, they're like, oh, okay. This has happened. So they're becoming more responsive to the notion of actual building trust, the stuff I was talking about, that being an integral and a kind of a differentiator for companies going forward. So it's changing slowly.
Yeah, I think also from that perspective, from like an investment perspective, almost inaction from investors could actually drive this. So if, and there has been some quite well documented sort of pullouts of investment or changes of direction because of platforms' lack of safety or lack of care in this area, and almost that may be the push that says to platforms, okay, when we're going into growth and investment, actually that lack of safety puts us second in line to somebody else who has this in place.
Yeah, and I think you have, first of all, Tech for Good is a really good example that can give us hope that VCs are looking more in that area. You do have the fact that over the last 3 to 5 years, there have been some really high-profile incidents of user safety breaches on platforms that have driven public perception to recognise the need for improved user safety standards, and VCs are following that. And then you have the kind of final element that is legislation is coming in. We proposed it in the Online Harms white paper. We will be working on that. If companies want to get ahead of the curve and get first mover advantage, VCs and they should be acting now. But that should also drive investment.
On GDPR as a model for safety by design, a question on Slido is that with the challenges in the implementation of GDPR, is it the right model that we need to be looking at here? Are there any pitfalls that we've experienced with GDPR so far that we would need to consider when it comes to safety by design? Rachel, I know you
yes, that's a really good question. The principles are good, though, in the GDPR. It's the execution that will be the challenge, and it has massively changed how companies handle consumer data. And Helen Dixon, the Irish data protection regulator, is investigating WhatsApp, Facebook, and a number of other large companies, and she's reached a decision on that, which she's sharing with the other data protection regulators across Europe. So we're expecting the rulings come out in December, and I think we will see a massive change in terms of companies recognizing, actually, these fines can be really good and they're really big, so therefore we need to behave in a more responsible way. I think the principle of having a child safety impact and having an ethical, looking at things from an ethical perspective, and in the context of AI, thinking about what are the unintended consequences of developing these algorithms, what is the mechanism we should put in place to make sure that there's transparency and accountability built in. So I think the principles are correct. People may argue about the execution and whether the fines and the enforcement are big enough, but the principles I think are good to lift and adapt.
Any other questions from the audience?
I remember in the old days, I'm old enough to remember when the internet was self-policing, it wasn't commercialised, it was funded by governments, primarily the US. You got mail bombed if you did anything which breached etiquette, etc. Based on what you were saying, Rachel, about funding and fundraising, I mean, the design is primarily funded by the advertising industry, as we heard earlier on. Should not government take it back and start to fund it directly to deliver the services that we need, rather than let the commercial guys, making massive profits out of it, lead the design?
Yeah, that is an amazing concept. And I think in the discussions that are taking place, and the Competition Markets Authority and Vestager was leading at an EU level the whole talk about breaking up these large companies, and then the scope for governments to reclaim a greater level of control, and because these are essentially sometimes public services. So I think those debates are happening. The fact that there's a looming recession is a little bit of a challenge, and the fact that regulators are not being sufficiently funded is also a challenge, and the fact that it takes so long. I mean, it took about 6 years and an insane amount of lobbying against the GDPR for it to come into.
Wasn't IGF set up in the first place to spin off the UN so that UN didn't have to police it?
Yeah. Yes. It's a good question that needs to be examined a bit more.
Picking up on that point, the 100 or so advertisers who pay for the internet are said to be coming together to try and audit the programmatic advertising algorithms to discover whether they're actually getting value for money, whether the clicks are genuine, and also how many of the clicks are in fact alongside content that does harm to their brands as opposed to enhancing them. Is that actually likely to lead to more change than anything government or regulators might do? Particularly if, given that we're going into recession, the advertisers want value from their spend.
And can we just take the question at the front there as well?
Olivier Crepin-Levelon, ISOC England. We've heard just a moment ago that it's impossible, technologically speaking, to focus solely on the content itself. And one has to, if I understand correctly, look further at actual behavior online. Are you surely not advocating that online behavior has to be tracked even further than it already is?
Okay, advertising and online behavior.
Because there's a lot of tracking of online behavior, certainly by algorithms and so on, and it's not just content as such that is getting analyzed, but the whole behavior of an internet user.
So I'll jump in on the behaviour point, and I think what we were more saying is that there has been a sort of potentially an overfocus on content moderation, and actually we have to understand better the behaviours that have led to harms online. Obviously, an aspect of that might be behaviour tracking, but that's why one of the challenges actually that we didn't talk about earlier was balancing things like safety by design against the rights of privacy, against security, against actually usability as well. And that's where, that's also a challenge. But I wouldn't say that we're necessarily saying that you must go and track everyone. That would be the wrong approach.
Yeah, can I jump in there? So when you're tracking criminal activity online, you don't have to surveil the entire community. What you need to do is react when you get a report that says that is reviewed by an expert, and it's like, oh, this is negative behavior. And then it's about leveraging technology in such a way that you say, okay, is this guy, say for example, grooming kids, what kind of network does he have? What are the ways in which he approaches? There are a number of variables that you can run an AI thing to have a look and see. Are there any risks associated with this? Is this a paedophile ring? So you're not surveilling the entire community. You're just reacting to those triggers and flags that say, okay, this legally meets the requirement that it should be investigated and should be passed on to the police. So it's about, and again, it's not because people often get very polarized in the surveilling and the privacy kind of thing. It's about using the information that's provided to you about behaviors that are indicative and have been, for example, reported or surfaced during an investigation. There's bad stuff going on here, we need to do something about it. And then having the appropriate mechanisms in place to handle that.
It's laudable, but as long as there's no due process for this, it's very difficult to know whether it happens or not. Whether you're just targeting the bad people or whether it's... Because today you're seeing everyone being tracked online for advertising purposes for all this. And it's very easy to use the same system to actually track bad behavior. In fact, it's just a click of a button.
Yeah.
So
it would be good if they flipped it to just...
So if I can add to that, I actually recognize that your question is kind of ties to what happens, who's regulating the people who are trying to do things for good.
Mm-hmm.
So again, coming from a tech for good background, actually very close to the work that you do. I used to do counter-violent extremism online and algorithms for that. So my concern when I was doing that work was what's regulating me and how am I making responsible decisions to make sure that when I'm doing this work that I'm above board and working towards my own values. And again, we work with businesses, commercial businesses, as well as tech for good companies and startups, and tell them, have you plotted out all the unintended consequences, negative and positive, that could happen, and what is your way of mitigating this, or what are the trade-offs that you have to go through, and tying that to what their principles are.
Yeah.
So there is a framework to start with, saying what are your values as a company, as an organization, what are the things that you want to do responsibly, how do we tie that to the unintended consequences, then what are you going to do about that now, what's your responsibility?
Yeah.
And that's why I keep going on about responsible technology, that's the process that we see, and part of it, the plotting out of the unintended consequences, is the safety by design.
Yes.
It is one and the same, but it's a part of that whole innovation cycle, responsible innovation cycle.
That's a really good point. And a classic example of that being messed up was when MySpace, back in the day, do you remember MySpace? They scrubbed their database with a database of known child sex offenders and didn't have processes in place to handle it, and then went, oh, holy guacamole, we've got 92,000 convicted pedophiles on our platform. What shall we do now? We have no processes within which to pass this on to law enforcement. And then it was a PR disaster because they said, oh, we've just 20,000. And of course the truth came out. So you do need to have exactly those types of processes in place, and they need to be transparent and accountable, and there needs to be a regulatory oversight mechanism to that. Who guards the guardians.
And we're broadly seeing a change in company behaviour on this over the last few years. I think the latest phrase is profit with a purpose is kind of popular at the moment. So we talked a lot about internet governance in 2050 today. Where do you see safety by design in 2050? Is it absolutely central towards the entire system? Do we have do we have a digital identity online that solves this, or kind of where does everyone see the future in this area?
I would hope that by 2050, safety by design is such an instinctive, embedded principle that we're not having to talk about it in this way. It should be, like I said, instinctive, but also people are doing it consciously. I think it's interesting how many companies I talk to at the moment who are doing fantastic gold standard safety, but don't recognise the processes or the considerations they've gone through because it's not conscious yet, and we need to be at that point.
So ideally, we'd reach a point where it's obsolete. In 2050, people won't remember what safety by design is because it's what we do. And I mean, part of what the reason I joined Everyone was because they were saying that we want everyone to responsible innovation to be what's done, and responsible technology to be the new normal. So if we reach the new normal, responsible technology, then we won't need safety by design, because the processes and frameworks will be there. More and more people will be doing this consciously, and we will have regulation that supports us and also incentivizes good behavior. I think that's a very important part as well.
David?
Well, I think kind of the key thing looking at 2050, which kind of is scary in itself, is, you know, we're, even compared to a few years ago where, you know, now we're talking about digital natives, children that are growing up where the internet is almost just life. And really by the time we get to 2050 and it's, you know, so embedded in everything that we do, and, you know, even compared to now, yeah, as you say, it will just be the world. It won't be the difference between the online world and the world. So it should just be, yeah, the new normal.
Rachel?
Yeah, it's funny. It's like, do you go for a dystopian view? If we don't get this right now at this inflection point, you know, it's kind of like, I think it's critical on this on us and people like us in this context to really work hard now and work toward 2050 in mind. And I think a shorter term goal is that we will have effective ways to check. You know, I hope that we'll look back in 5 to 7 years' time and say, oh my God, we used to let kids go anywhere on the internet. What were we thinking? Like, how do we think that was going to work out? That we would have solved that problem. And I think that would be a really good kind of first step. That we would work towards enabling, and again, this answering the question that was about the advertising ecosystem. It's already evolving. There's been lots of companies that have been merged or have ceased to exist. So the model is likely to change. And there's a guy, Russell Drummond, who talks about, currently we have customer relation management kind of thing. So you get bombarded with ads all the time. We could flip that on its head and have a vendor relationship management, whereby with your sovereign identity you say, hey, I think I might go on holidays to maybe Spain this summer. This is my budget. So you reveal the information that you want to reveal, and you say, okay, travel agents, knock yourselves out to give me the best deal. So it's that kind of conceptualizing a different way that advertising, that whole economy might work. I think within a 5 to 10 year radius we might get there. Beyond that, I'm just like, well, I don't know. But those would be significant steps, I think, to reshaping our digital economy.
Great. Sorry.
So I was going to say, there's hope. There are people working on this.
Yes.
We work on this tirelessly and work with businesses again. And we have resources online that are free to access should you need them. So,
Great. Well, that's all the time we have for. So thanks to the panel. And I just wondered if anyone could thank the panel. Sorry. Right.